have to say it's been amazing to see the explosion in Korean content and production. Growing up in America, I often had to explain to people where Korea was on the map. Today, it's one of the cultural capitals of the world. So I want to thank all of you for your part in making Korea cool, at least for my kids and their friends. I'm here to talk today about the show that I developed and produced, Avatar: The Last Airbender. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's an epic fantasy series based on a popular animated show from the 2000s. We premiered on Netflix on February 22nd this year, and in our first 3 days on the service, we had over 21 million views. And in our first week, we were the #1 show in 73 countries around the world and hit the top 10 in 92 countries. And just yesterday, we were nominated for 2 Primetime Emmy Awards. So you would think with those numbers and that kind of response, we had always known success was inevitable. But truthfully, the road to bringing this story to life was long and hard, and there were many times I never thought we would see the light of day. I have this little ritual where every time a project I'm working on comes to an end, I box up all the files and I store it in my garage. And on Avatar, I boxed up my files at least 3 times during the process. So why was it so challenging? Well, I'm going to take you through the show's creative development process and hopefully give you an idea of all that's involved in bringing a show like Avatar to life. But first, some quick background. Avatar: The Last Airbender premiered in 2005 as an animated series on the American kids cable channel Nickelodeon. It had been created by Michael DiMartino and Brian Konietzko, 2 animators who had been friends since college. They both had long been fascinated with Asian culture and stories. And their influences range from Hong Kong films to Japanese anime. In fact, 2 of the biggest inspirations for Avatar were Cowboy Bebop and the films of Miyazaki. Avatar premiered on February 21st, 2005, and was an instant hit. It told the story of Aang, a 12-year-old boy who lived in a world divided into 4 nations based on the 4 classical elements: water, earth, fire, and air. Some people in this world have the ability to manipulate or bend the elements, but only one person in every generation, the Avatar, can bend all 4 elements and keep peace in the world. At the start of the story, Aang, a goofy, fun-loving kid, doesn't yet realize he is the next Avatar. And he's caught in a storm and ends up frozen in an iceberg. So when the brutal Fire Nation launches a surprise attack to conquer the world, the Avatar isn't around to stop them. 100 years later, Aang wakes up and discovers not only a world that's been devastated by war, but he learns he is the only survivor of his nation. He is the last Airbender. And now he must team up with some new friends to stop the Fire Nation and bring balance back to the world. Here are I'm going to play the opening titles from the animated series, which summarizes the premise.
Water, earth, fire, air. Long ago, the 4 nations lived together in harmony. Then, everything changed when the Fire Nation attacked. Only the Avatar, master of all 4 elements, could stop them. But when the world needed him most, he vanished. 100 years passed and my brother and I discovered the new Avatar, an airbender named Aang. And although his airbending skills are great, he has a lot to learn before he's ready to save anyone. But I believe Aang can save the world.
So the show was unique in many ways. Tonally, it featured a blend of action, emotion, and humor. And even though it was targeted for children, the storytelling was sophisticated enough to satisfy adult audiences. And it tackled topics such as the brutality of war, genocide, sexism, even animal cruelty. But what really set Avatar: The Last Airbender apart was that it was an epic fantasy rooted in Asian culture and storytelling traditions. Most other popular fantasies, such as Game of Thrones, Lord of the Rings, even Harry Potter, have Western European roots. Avatar was groundbreaking in its cultural representation. Here in Korea, everyone is used to seeing Asian faces in their shows and movies. But in the US, it was, and unfortunately still is, a big deal. Over its 3 seasons, Avatar became a massive hit, and the show only grew in popularity in subsequent years. It spawned comic books, a sequel series called The Legend of Korra, and lots of merchandising. In 2010, M. Night Shyamalan, director of The Sixth Sense, wrote and directed a live-action feature adaptation called The Last Airbender. It cost $150 million and was supposed to be the first in a trilogy of Avatar films. But it was a critical and commercial disappointment. Fans pointed to a variety of reasons for its failure, chief among them, poor story and character development, uninspired visual effects, and whitewashed casting, meaning that characters who had been Asian and indigenous in the cartoon had been cast with white actors. I'm not here to criticize Shyamalan or the movie. To be honest, I've never seen it. I missed it when it was in theaters, and when I started work on our version of Avatar, I deliberately avoided watching it. But that's not to say I wasn't aware of the criticisms, and I bring them up because it's important to understand the level of expectations and concern among the fan base regarding our show. In other words, despite the huge popularity of the original cartoon, success for a live-action television version wasn't guaranteed. If anything, the attitude out there was wary at best. In 2018, Netflix announced they had signed a deal with the original creators, Brian and Mike, to create a live-action television adaptation of Avatar. For fans, this was hugely promising. But after about a year of development, the project stalled. Brian and Mike were brilliant world builders, but they didn't have any experience in live-action television, and so they found the process challenging. At that point, Netflix decided it was time for them to partner them with someone else, and that's where I come in. One of the producers Netflix had recruited for the project was Dan Lin. Now, I had worked with Dan on an NBC pilot a few years earlier, and we had had a good experience working together. So with the backing of Dan and his production company, I met with Netflix, and in December of 2019, they asked me to come on board the show as executive producer and showrunner. You may have heard recently that Dan became the chairman of Netflix Films. I worked with Brian and Mike for a few months, and I wrote a pilot script with their involvement, one that Netflix was very excited about. They felt the project had gotten back on track. But Brian and Mike decided that continuing with the show was not in their best interests, and they stepped away. That's the first time I thought the show was dead. That's because one of the lessons I think we've learned when adapting popular IP is that the involvement of the original creators can be crucial. Netflix's One Piece became a hit, and notably, it had the blessing of Eiichiro Oda, the manga's legendary creator. Similarly, Disney's Percy Jackson, based on the hugely popular book series, succeeded in large part because the book's author, Rick Riordan, was closely involved with the show and approved all the changes. On the other hand, Netflix's Cowboy Bebop, which did not have the support of the original anime's creator, did not fare as well with the fans or with general audiences. So, the departure of Avatar's original creators could have been a critical blow to our show. But fortunately, Netflix was excited enough in the vision that I had laid out for the series that they gave me the green light to continue. For my part, I had to decide how I was going to proceed creatively. In adapting something as complex as Avatar, I realized it was going to be necessary to take the story in new directions. Things were going to have to change. And that was a risky proposition given that the original creators were no longer involved. To explain how I approached adapting the source material, let me first tell you a little bit about my personal connection to the show. I was introduced to the original Avatar through my daughter, Emily. When she was growing up, it was her favorite show. I used to come home and find her seated in front of the TV watching it. So I watched it with her. And both of us were swept away by the action, humor, and the epic storytelling. It was also important to me that she was watching a story featuring Asian characters in an Asian-influenced world. That my daughter, an Asian American child, was able to see characters who looked like her on screen was game-changing. As I said before, those opportunities were and still are too rare. So even before I met with Netflix, I was an Avatar fan. And it was important to me to make sure that any live-action adaptation felt authentic. Authentic to the story, authentic to the characters, and authentic especially to the cultural influences. Whatever we created had to feel like the show that my daughter and I had fallen in love with. Now, being authentic does not mean being identical. Too often, adaptations of popular IP try and stick too close to the original, even when it doesn't make sense to do so. I knew from the start this couldn't be a shot-for-shot remake of the cartoon. For one thing, the structure and format of an hour-long drama was very different from that of a half-hour cartoon. The first season of the original animated Avatar series consisted of 20 30-minute episodes, most of them self-contained stories. Essentially, they were adventures of the week. Our version, the live-action Netflix version, we produced 8 hour-long episodes, and Netflix, as a streaming service, emphasized binge viewing, which meant serialized storytelling. So we had to find a way to take 20 separate short stories and turn them into one long, ongoing story. Narratively, what that meant was breaking down the plot and the themes from the original, laying them out like puzzle pieces, and then putting them back together to create a single cohesive arc. In some instances, we took characters from separate episodes and combined their storylines when it made sense. We looked for thematic parallels in their arcs so they could reflect and complement each other. We also gave the heroes a strong goal for the season. At the beginning of our story, Aang has a vision that he has to get to the North Pole to save the waterbenders who live there from a great danger. That created a sense of urgency. So it didn't feel like our characters were just moving from one adventure to the next. They needed to get somewhere. We also made sure all of the characters' actions had consequences. Things that happened in one episode affected events in another. If someone got hurt, they wouldn't magically be healed by the next episode. With the original cartoon, you could skip episodes and still enjoy the show. With our series, all the narrative elements built on each other. Finally, we tried to give more emotional depth to some of the stories. For instance, in the cartoon, there's an episode where Aang visits the city of Omashu and has a showdown with an eccentric king named Bumi. The change we made in our version was to root Bumi's eccentricity in the pain and despair he's felt in leading his people through a brutal war. Same story, but different emotional shading. So I'm going to show you a clip showing excerpts from the fight between Aang and Bumi from both versions. First, the animated series, and the way we did it in our live action.
Typical airbender tactic. Avoid and evade. I'd hope the Avatar would be less predictable. Don't you have any surprises for me? Sooner or later, you'll have to strike back. Oh, you'll have to be a little more creative than that. Did someone leave the windows open? It feels a little drafty in here. Are you hoping I'll catch a cold?
Please, Boomy, you don't have to do this.
Oh, but I do. Some of us have to fight even when we don't want to. That's what it means to be in a war. You can't rely on anyone, even your friends. Especially your friends.
Again, same story, slightly different emotional shading. In both the original series and the live action, the two characters have an exciting fight. But we tried to add a little more emotional depth by making the character of Bumi a symbol of the painful conflict that the entire world has gone through for a century. This is just one example of how we were able to preserve the story elements that fans already knew and loved, but reframe them to be part of a larger narrative. The goal was to feel fresh, but also familiar. That's a phrase we used a lot during the production of our show, fresh but familiar. Probably the most important thing in making sure our adaptation felt authentic was to make sure that we got the characters right. They had to feel like the characters that fans loved, but that was easier said than done. For one thing, all the characters in the cartoon are kids. They range in age from about 12 to about 17. Now, it's one thing to draw a 12-year-old. It's another to find a real-life 12-year-old who can really act. There's a reason Hollywood tends to traditionally cast older actors for roles like this. But we wanted to be authentic to the characters, and that meant casting real kids. Another challenge, every character in the world of Avatar is either Asian or indigenous. That meant casting only Asian and indigenous actors. One of the biggest criticisms of the Shyamalan movie was that they had cast white actors for all the roles. Now, to be fair, there was a time when that was considered acceptable in Hollywood, but times and sensitivities have changed. More importantly, representation was personally important to me. As I said earlier, that was one of the biggest gifts that I took away from experiencing the show with my daughter. And so I felt racial authenticity was vital to the success of the show. So we searched the world for young Asian and indigenous actors. In addition to scouring the US and Canada, we saw auditions from Asia, Australia, and Europe. We auditioned non-actors, stunt performers, anyone. It wasn't an easy process, but we knew that the success of the show depended on it. And in the end, it all paid off. We discovered what I considered to be the perfect cast. For Aang, we cast Gordon Cormier, who's of Filipino descent. He was 11 when we cast him. Katara and Sokka were played by Gowan Dio and Ian Owsley, who are both of Native American descent. Zuko, Prince of the Fire Nation, is played by Chinese-American actor Dallas Liu. And Azula, Zuko's sister, is played by Elizabeth Yu, who is half Korean. Once we had our cast, we wanted to make sure that they visually resonated with fans. They needed to be instantly recognizable as the characters that they played. So our costume department referred constantly back to the cartoon for inspiration. At the same time, they added a lot more detail and texture to everything. That was a big part of the process of bringing this world to life, fleshing everything out so it all felt grounded and real. We couldn't be two-dimensional, which the animated series was by definition. To that end, we hired indigenous and native artisans to create all of the detail work on Katara and Sokka's costumes. Everything you see there was created by actual indigenous costume designers. So we wanted their look not only to evoke the cartoon, but also to be culturally authentic. And that brings me to one of the most important aspects of the franchise, the cultural influences reflected in the show. Even though Avatar is set in a fantasy world, the four nations in the story, water, earth, fire, air, all correspond to specific cultures in the real world. So the water tribes are inspired by indigenous Arctic cultures. The Earth Kingdom is representative of East Asia, such as China, Japan, Korea, and India. The Earth Kingdom, the Fire Nation, reflects Southeast Asia, primarily the Philippines, Thailand, and Indonesia. I know this map is a little wrong. The Air Nomads are inspired by monastic cultures in Tibet and Nepal. So these cultural inspirations were established in the cartoon, but they took on greater weight when adapted for live action. If a story is supposed to be set in a town in Japan, we couldn't rely on an animated background that looked vaguely Asian. We had to build sets that were authentically Japanese. Similarly, an Indian palace, this is actually King Bhumi's palace, had to be reflective of actual Indian architecture and design. And then when we had a feast in that palace, all the food that was featured had to be authentic. So we hired Indian caterers to create all the food that you see in the scene. We had cultural consultants help us with everything from the design of our sets to creating the Chinese calligraphy seen on screen. So our commitment to cultural authenticity filtered down to the smallest level. For example, I made sure characters always took their shoes off when entering a room. That's not something anyone but an Asian person would notice. But that's the good thing about having an Asian person in charge. So those were the guiding principles we used in bringing our version of Avatar: The Last Airbender to life. As I said before, it wasn't easy. It was a long and painstaking process. I started work on the show in December of 2019, and we premiered in February of 2024, which meant I spent 4 years of my life producing 8 episodes of television. People often ask me whether I think it's possible for other adaptations of other popular IP to be successful. Can there be more avatars? My answer to that is that every IP is different and comes with different challenges. Many things have to fall into place for a show to succeed. So I can't say that there's a single formula for success. But I do think there is one ingredient that all successful adaptations share, and that's a creator's passion for the source material. When I think back to how we approached Avatar, the main thing that comes to mind is how much we all believed in the show that we were making. I'm sure there are lots of Korean webtoons and animes and other IP waiting to be turned into global hits. And the market in Hollywood is more receptive to them than ever. Every studio is looking for a great idea, and that can come from anywhere. The key is to find a creative partner who not only has the right credentials and resources, but who believes in the material. You don't want someone who just agrees to do your show. You want someone who needs to do your show. Because that person won't be afraid to make changes to the source material when necessary, but will also understand and preserve the spirit of the original. I believe that balance is what's necessary for a successful adaptation. That belief for me has paid off in more ways than one. 2 weeks after our premiere, Netflix ordered seasons 2 and 3 of Avatar so that we can wrap up the story of Aang and his friends. And in a sign of how things have come full circle, my daughter Emily, the one who introduced me to Avatar, the one who inspired me to take on this project in the first place, just joined the show as a writer for the 3rd season. She just started this Monday. So in the end, Avatar: The Last Airbender may be a massive global property, but for me, it's always come down to a father and daughter sharing an adventure together. And my hope is that there are other fathers and daughters out there who are getting the same experience from our show. And if that happens, then we'll have truly succeeded. Thank you.